Good Wednesday morning. Earlier this week in conversation with Diane, we discussed fruitfulness. She's been studying the parables of Jesus and his teachings regarding fruitfulness. The fig tree with no fruit, for example, Jesus cursed. Fruitlessness is tough to preach about because the people who need to hear it, they look good, but they're not. And these people tend to take offense when they're confronted with their lack of produce. Today's Old Testament passage in Isaiah 5 deals with the subject of spiritual fruitfulness, or the lack thereof, and it's kind of a big deal. I'll sing a ballad to the one I love, a ballad about his vineyard. The one I love had a vineyard, a fine, well-placed vineyard. He hoed the soil and pulled the weeds and planted the very best vines. He built a lookout, built a winepress, a vineyard to be proud of. He looked for a vintage yield of grapes, but for all of his pains, he got junk grapes. Now listen to what I'm telling you, you who live in Jerusalem and Judah. What do you think is going on between me and my vineyard? Can you think of anything I could have done to my vineyard that I didn't do? When I expected good grapes, why did I get bitter grapes? Well now, let me tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. I'll tear down its fences and let it go to ruin. I'll knock down the gate and let it be trampled. I'll turn it into a patch of weeds, untended, uncared for. Thistles and thorns will take over. I'll give orders to the clouds. Don't rain on that vineyard ever. Do you get it? The vineyard of God of the angel armies is the country of Israel. All the men and women of Judah are the garden he was so proud of. He looked for a crop of justice, and he saw them murdering each other. He looked for a harvest of righteousness, and he heard only the moans of victims. At first glance, one might think God has a brown thumb. He doesn't seem to do very well in the human vineyard department. His first vineyard, the Garden of Eden, it was very good. Man was given dominion over the beast, commanded to be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it. And he was guarded from every danger by the arms of the Almighty. Yet the time came when God looked upon his vineyard for the fruits of what he'd done. And what did he find when he looked? The wickedness of man was great upon the earth. The vineyard that should have brought forth sweet grapes had brought forth bitter grapes. God's care for man had been met by man with nothing but ingratitude. God planted another vineyard we call the people of Israel, planted on the very fruitful plain of Palestine, a fine vineyard of oil and honey, a land where they could eat bread without lack. God fenced his vineyard around with moral laws as if they were a mountain fortress. He cleared out from it the stones that marred its soil, the wicked nation's stones of offense, if you will. And he planted it with choice vines. The children of faithful Abraham built a tower, Jerusalem. In the middle of it, he made a winepress, the temple, where he would have the gifts and offerings of his people. And when he looked at that vineyard, expecting to see sweet grapes, all he saw was bitterness. Oppression, wrong, robbery, murder, forms of religion with no power, covetousness, drunkenness, vanity, impurity. These were what the eyes of God saw when he looked on his chosen people. God provided greater benefits on the second vineyard than he did the first, and it produced even deeper ingratitude. And here we are in God's third and final attempt to plant a vineyard. He calls it his church. He's fenced it around, separated it from the rest of mankind with holy ordinances and his Holy Spirit. He's removed the stones of false teaching, planted it with good vines, chosen vessels who from his grace have been converted from unbelief to true faith, vines like the Apostle Paul. He's given it for its tower the strength of himself, and for the winepress the book of life in which he records good deeds. And now, what does God see in his third and final vineyard? Has his constant tender care awakened gratitude? Eschatologically, I know it will. And I know the church will be triumphant. I guess the question of the day is, when God looks at the vine that is me, does he see sweet grapes or bitter? Lord, you do everything right. And so often it turns out so wrong. My natural inclination, God, is to blame you, when in fact my fruitlessness is all too often born out of my ingratitude for all you've done for me. Lord, forgive me. Diane, if any of today's devotion applies to our discussion on fruitfulness and the Holy Spirit inspires you to preach it, feel free to use anything you heard here, because it's not original with me. It's been there in the Bible all along.